What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the Chasing Clarity Health and Fitness Podcast. This is your host, Brandon Cruz, and today is episode 107, where we're going to discuss the science of food addiction and whether certain foods really can be addictive. In the last two episodes of the show, I covered the science of food cravings and the most effective ways to kill your cravings. And that series prompted a lot of comments and questions from those of you out in the audience. And there were several individuals who mentioned that they almost felt like they had addictive like behaviors towards certain foods and felt a loss of control when eating them. So that prompted me to cover the topic of food addiction, which is something rarely covered in the nutrition space. But my goal with this podcast is to explain some of the mechanisms as to why you may struggle with controlling yourself around certain foods more than other foods. As increasing awareness around some of the effects highly processed and hyperpalatable foods can have on your eating behaviors and your drive to eat is the first step to gaining awareness around this issue, and also taking the steps to modify your diet and your behaviors to help to reduce the likelihood of overeating and losing control with your food intake. Now, there's a lot of debate in the scientific community as to whether food and or eating can be considered an addiction. But research has identified foods with addictive-like properties, which are foods that are more common to crave, they're harder to stop eating once you start, and can cause you to feel a loss in control when eating them. So, over the last 15 years, there's been a lot of talk and a lot of research done looking at whether food addiction exists. And much of the research done over the last 15 years, especially, has found that eating in and of itself is not an addictive activity, as we all need to eat to live. So, it's not that food is an addictive substance in general, but more so that certain foods have addictive like properties, which can cause us to engage in addictive like behaviors. So the research leans in the direction that certain foods, which are mostly highly processed foods, have properties that can allow them to be classified as an addictive like substance, similar to that of, say, something like nicotine or alcohol. And just within the last few years, there have been some extensive systematic reviews that have looked into the evidence on food addiction. So, in a 2018 systematic review, which was conducted, they looked at 52 studies, and the review of the literature found that the evidence we have supports food addiction as a unique construct consistent with criteria for other substance use disorder diagnoses. The evidence further suggests that certain foods, particularly processed foods with added sweeteners, sugars, fats, demonstrate the greatest addictive potential. Then, in a 2020 run review, they also found that the existing literature suggests biological and behavioral similarities between food addiction and substance addiction, with ultra processed foods high in both added fat and refined carbohydrates being most implicated and involved in addictive like eating behaviors. So we see in the literature, like when we look at systematic reviews, meta-analyses, which are, broad based interpretations of the research, looking and scanning through, dozens upon dozens of randomized control trials, we do see that there are certain class of or certain categories of foods that elicit addictive like eating behaviors, which is really where the research on food addiction has been really focused on within the last decade plus or so. So that's really what we're going to cover in today's podcast. So before we get any deeper into this topic, let's define a food addiction and really what that is, as many hear this term and misconstrue what it actually is. So the term food addiction, implies that someone gets addicted to food and to the act of eating. But the vast majority of research that we have on this topic finds that it's not that food in general is addictive. It's more so that some foods have addictive properties and characteristics that lead to addictive like behaviors. So when I talk about food addiction within the context of this podcast, please realize that I'm referring to the notion that specific foods have addictive like properties, which can cause negative consequences. However, I am not saying that food is in general is addictive, as just like different sources of calories are not created equal in terms of their effects on our appetite, our satiety, the thermic effect of feeding, and our energy expenditure levels, and then our body composition outcomes in general. Not all food sources are created equal in terms of their potential to cause addictive like eating behaviors. So, the class of foods that are most commonly associated with behaviors that mimic substance abuse including like excess consumption of that product, loss of control around that food, strong cravings and urges for that food, and a strong or a difficult time, controlling your intake of that food, are highly processed and hyperpalatable foods, especially those which feature a highly concentrated combination of sugar, starch, salt, and or fat. And this is because if we compare some of the properties, components, and effects of highly processed hyperpalatable foods with addictive substances like nicotine and alcohol, there are some striking similarities. So we compare and contrast some of the similarities between the two. We see that both have a high dose of rewarding ingredients slash compounds that can increase our liking and wanting for these items. Both of these categories of items or substances have a rapid rate of absorption, which has a profound impact on our brains. So just like if you were to take a hit of cigarette and essentially you get that burst or that hit of nicotine, it's going to cause a dopamine secretion. The same thing happens with a lot of these high glycemic, highly processed foods that get readily absorbed and digested and cause that dopamine release in the brain. And then both addictive like substances like nicotine and alcohol, as well as highly processed hyperpalatable foods, they have a high potential for forming new habits, which can potentially create addictions. So, right now, if we look at the state of food addiction and we look at the DSM of the American Psychiatric Association, they don't currently categorize food as an addictive substance. But there's been more and more research coming out since around 2009 when the Yale Food Addiction Scale was developed and validated, which finds that certain foods can have addictive properties to them. So it's not that we're addicted to all food overall, as we need food to survive, but we can develop addictive like behaviors with certain trigger foods, which is what I'm going to focus on today's show. So before we get into the research on food addiction and what foods can be classified as addictive, I want to cover the properties of the foods that increase the likelihood of us experiencing and causing addictive like eating behaviors. So, there are certain characteristics and properties of food that can make some foods more addictive than others, meaning some foods have an increased likelihood to cause us to develop issues with moderating our consumption of them as compared to other food sources. So, if we go through these properties, you'll see, some of the commonalities between a lot of foods that we associate or we have personal experience having trouble moderating or having trouble not overeating. And you'll realize that a lot of these characteristics and properties are also in line with what we see with addictive like food substances. So these properties include being highly processed, meaning these foods are chemically engineered and man made, not whole foods found in nature. The next would be being hyper palatable. So these items, these foods, are super tasty and flavorful and cause us to want to eat more of them. These foods have a high energy density, so they contain a lot of calories per bite and per gram, and they contain concentrated combinations of palatability inducing nutrients, which drive up the hedonic reward we receive from these foods when eating them, but we get little satiety for them. So, there's a big, I always say for every gimme, there's a gotcha. You get a lot of flavor, but you also get very little fullness. And so when I refer to these concentrated combinations of palatability inducing nutrients, what I mean is that these foods will often contain combinations of refined sugar, starch, salt, and fat to maximize their reward value. And then last, they also tend to be very seductive and appealing, which is not only due to how tasty they are, but also because they're cheap, they're convenient, and they're readily accessible. And there's also, that's more so from you know, our ability to access them. But also, if you think about how a lot of these highly processed, hyperpalatable foods are marketed, there's a ton of marketing and advertising behind these products, which increases the amount of exposure we get to cues for these foods and increase our desire for them. So it's like everywhere you turn, there's an advertisement. Or, it's so interesting because I lived in a small shore town and we used to have, say, one McDonald's in town. And now when I go back to visit my mother, I will literally see, a McDonald's on one end of the street corner, and then right down the block, there's another one. So it's like we are constantly surrounded by these food cues, these advertisements, these billboards, commercials, social media, food porn pages, things like that, where we're always getting exposure to these foods, which often drive us to want to consume these foods or want to purchase them. And once you buy them and they're in your house, if they're in sight, they're more likely to be in mind and also be in your mouth. So there's many factors that cause these foods to drive us to eat and overeat, but they also have addictive properties, which cause us to have much more difficulty moderating our consumption of. Now, it's important to realize that natural substances, such as whole foods, are not naturally addictive. Almost every addictive substance we have, including nicotine, alcohol, and hyperpalatable foods, are man made and go through a lot of processing and refinement to actually become an addictive substance. Because if you look at their natural constituents, they aren't addictive in nature. Now, if you look at the evolution of our modern food technology and how many foods are made, or how many foods are made now, as compared to in the past, you can see how whole foods have turned into highly processed foods, which can cause us to develop issues where we can't control ourselves when consuming these highly processed versions of foods that used to be highly satiating. So, when we look at like the evolution of foods, because you have to realize that even ultra processed foods, a lot of them came from whole food ingredients. Like, for instance, the potato is the most highly satiating food on the satiety index. However, now we have, fried potato chips, and we have all these different variations of those potato chips where they've been so deconstructed from their whole food satiating form of a potato into something that's just kind of like a frankenfood, which can often cause us to, there's many slogans. So bet you can't eat just one. Once you pop, the fun don't stop. And those are truisms, meaning that they say that as like a catch-all term, like these are these mottos and these catchphrases and things of that sort. But think about the fact that you probably have never been able to just have one chip and not go in for the bag for more. So these are things that they've been so um, designed, they've been so deconstructed from their natural form that they cause us to overeat in excess. So our food environment has drastically changed in the past 50 to 60 years. And with those changes have come rising rates of obesity and many more individuals struggling to improve their body composition, their health, and fitness. And if we look at it from an evolutionary perspective, we evolved to seek out calorie dense foods to be able to consume enough energy to survive. As for much of human history, we did not have an unlimited access to food as we do now. So our food, our reward centers were designed to seek out food properties that signified calories, such as savory fats that signal high energy content, and then sweetness that signals sugar, which is a quick source of energy. However, for the vast majority of human history, calorie dense foods were scarce. And when we did encounter them, they were in a limited amounts or they were available for very limited periods of time. The issue is we are now in an environment where we have unlimited access to these highly, calorie dense foods at all times. And in nature, we would only find single ingredient whole foods, and we rarely encountered a food combination of which featured both a high amount of carbs and fats. And we certainly didn't find, highly concentrated of tasty foods that had both high sugar and high fat content. So if you ever actually think back to like what we ate evolutionarily, we had only a few classifications or a few types of foods. We had high protein foods like meat, we had higher carb foods like berries and fruit, and we had higher fat foods like nuts. But most of these foods required a lot of energy to find and had properties within them that made them satiating, like fiber and water content. However, food technology has made it so that we now have highly concentrated foods filled with refined starches and fats, yet these processed foods are so refined that they've taken out the fiber and water content so they're not filling, and they have additives like sugar, salt, and artificial flavorings added to them to make them tastier, more appealing, cheap, and easy to access, and much more likely to overeat. The foods that are hardest for us to moderate are these highly processed combinations of starch, sugar, and fat, including items like chocolate, ice cream, cookies, pizza, french fries, and potato chips. And I encourage you to look at the macro and calorie breakdown of these foods and specifically at the fat and carb content and think if you can find any naturally occurring whole foods that contain a similar macronutrient profile. So take a second to really think that over. Can you find any foods in nature that have a similar macronutrient calorie profile to things like chocolate or ice cream or cookies or pizza? Because I've done this exercise myself, and I'll tell you just from my own perspective, even having worked in nutrition for well over 10 years, I cannot find a single food that has a similar macronutrient profile in nature, a whole food, that would be equivalent to that of a highly processed food. So, although we've evolved to seek out calorie containing foods to help us survive, we were not designed to encounter these highly palatable, highly processed foods, which is why the vast majority of individuals who struggle with overeating don't struggle with overeating nutrient dense whole foods like your lean proteins, your fruit and veg. They struggle with overeating combinations of refined carbs and fats that spike dopamine and cause us to want to eat more and more of them. For a long time, people have wondered if some individuals have an actual food addiction, but now researchers are looking at if certain foods may have addictive properties that prompt some to overeat. And in order to test this and to classify and identify food addiction and what foods are more addictive than others, researchers at Yale University developed the Yale Food Addiction Scale in 2009. Now, this scale uses the diagnostic criteria for substance use disorders and applies it to someone's intake of highly processed foods and looks at criteria associated with behavioral characteristics of substance abuse. And these are characteristics that you may have commonly associated with other substance use abuse disorders, such as alcoholism or having a smoking addiction or something of that sort. So these are several characteristics that are being used in the Yale Food Addiction Scale, which include overeating and feeling a loss of control when eating specific foods, strong cravings or intense urges to eat a specific food, an inability to cut down on that food despite experiencing negative consequences, continued use of that food despite negative side effects, and tolerance of that food, which, from the tolerance perspective, this more so refers to feeling as though you need more of the substance or more of this food to get the same pleasure response from it. And this skill has now been validated in both clinical and non clinical populations, meaning in those with actual issues with food, but then also in just general populations. And some of the characteristics that classify a food as being addictive include feeling like you have such strong, intense cravings for a food that you feel like you have to eat them right away when you experience a craving or urge for them. Another characteristic is feeling like you need more or you need to eat more of a food to get the feelings you wanted from eating, including the satiety and pleasure from that food. And the other feeling, which is really common, honestly, is wanting to cut down or to stop eating certain foods, but feeling like you couldn't. So it's this loss of control, and then it's almost like you're a victim to your own impulses, which is something that I have heard certain clients, reflect to me, or I've had discussions with other individuals, and they're like, before I knew it, I was already in the bag of chips, and it's like they were making decisions off of impulse rather than intellect and really thinking through their decisions. And there's some emotional components to that, but also it doesn't help when we have foods that are literally constructed and engineered to cause us to passively overeat. So it's multifactorial issue that we really have to work through. So next, I want to cover some of the most recent research on food addiction. Just this past year in 2023, one of the best known researchers in the field of food addiction, Dr. Gerhardt, published a review that broke down why highly processed foods can be considered addictive substances based on scientific criteria. To test this, researchers took the scientific criteria that the Surgeon General used to identify tobacco products as being addictive and applied it to highly processed foods to see how many of these criteria were met by highly processed foods. So the four main criteria that are used to identify an addictive product or substance is that they have the ability to, one, cause compulsive use, two, cause mood altering effects via their effect on the brain, three, they're able to reinforce that behavior, which causes us to want to consume more of that substance in the future, and four, they trigger strong cravings or urges. And this review went through each criteria and analyzed whether highly processed foods cause these effects or not. So their analysis found that highly processed foods fit the first criteria of compulsive use, which is an inability to stop despite a desire to do so and or negative consequences. And this is because many individuals want to improve their body composition and their health, yet they struggle to not overeat when they include highly processed foods in their diet and in their environment. And often they will continue to eat these foods despite experiencing negative consequences, such as weight gain, diet related disease, such as obesity, or even type 2 diabetes, or even just like predisposing factors. So that could be going from a normal BMI category to overweight and then into obesity, or going from a state of proper or good metabolic health into a state of being pre diabetic or insulin resistant. And then another component of that is just experiencing distress due to your eating behaviors, but continuing to engage in them. Now, the second primary criteria for food to be addictive is it has psychoactive effects on the brain, meaning it can alter our mood state. So, the body of evidence we have on how consuming highly processed foods impacts our mood find that due to the large dopamine release highly processed and hyperpalatable foods cause, many eat these foods and often overeat them for reasons outside of true physiological hunger, which is something we discussed on last week's podcast. So, if you guys need a breakdown between physiological hunger and psychological hunger, please go back to the last episode. But a lot of people will eat even in the absence of hunger, and they do so to they eat these foods for hedonic reasons, such as to feel pleasure and to reduce pain, to feel better and to improve mood. And when we look at the research which analyzes how much dopamine gets released after different activities, we see that addictive substances like alcohol and nicotine increase dopamine release by approximately 150 to 200%. Now, this has also been tested with highly processed foods and different macronutrients. And researchers found that Fonzie's, which I'm just giving you a particular product that they actually utilize in the research. There's a snack food called Fonzie's, which is a cheese corn snack. And that caused a 200% increase in baseline dopamine. So we're seeing right at the same equivalent ratings as nicotine or alcohol. Then when we look at fat as an isolated macronutrient, it increases dopamine release by about 150%. And sucrose, aka sugar, increases dopamine release by 150%. So we see that fat, sugar, and highly processed snacks, which are a combination of carbs and fats, increase dopamine release by about the same amount as addictive substances like alcohol and nicotine do. There's also been research done that has compared the levels of euphoria individuals feel in response to consuming specific products. So, for example, in this review, they compared the levels of euphoria between an addictive substance like nicotine and chocolate, which is one of the most addictive foods according to research. So, when comparing these entities, they found that 1.5 milligrams of nicotine given IV, so this was straight into the bloodstream, it increased the euphoria scale to a 6. Now, when we look at other actual food products, you'll be really surprised at the outcomes of this. So, they looked at cocoa chocolate, and that increased the euphoria scale to a 6.4. So, it exceeded that of nicotine. Then, when they looked at white chocolate, which is more of a man made chocolate with very little natural derivatives, it increased the euphoria scale to a 7. So, consuming chocolate produces a feeling in euphoria, which is a feeling of happiness greater than that of nicotine, which is a known addictive substance. The third criteria for a food to be addictive is it needs to be highly reinforcing. So, there's a sensitization effect to eating highly processed, hyperpalatable foods. So, the more you expose yourself to these foods, the more you'll want them. And this habit will get stronger over time, where you'll want these items more and more the more you eat them, as they have a very strong reinforcement effect, which can often turn them into a bad habit. So, the more we consume highly processed foods, especially those which are combinations of sugar and fat, the more our desire and wanting for these foods increases, even if our liking of these foods, aka the pleasure response we get, stays the same. So, research has found that our liking of a food may get desensitized over time, where we need to consume more of it to get that same pleasure response, but our wanting for that food will still go up due to repeated exposure. Meaning, the more times you eat a food that you have trouble moderating, the more you will struggle to avoid eating that food and moderating it in the future. And this is because over time, our sensitivity to food cues gets higher, which can increase our drive and motivation to seek out that particular food. This is another reason why so many people eat mindlessly or essentially engage in mindless eating, where they'll grab a cookie or a handful of nuts or just a particular snack when walking across the kitchen, or they go by the break room and they grab a muffin or a cookie and they don't even think twice about it. And then they realize that they weren't experiencing true hunger. They were just prompted by the food cues in their environment and the habit that they have, this habitual behavior where they always just grab for these foods and don't even think twice about them. They act off of impulse, essentially. And so the fourth and final criteria to determine if highly processed foods can be categorized as being addictive is they cause strong cravings. Now, this one is pretty intuitive because if you think about the foods you most often crave, they're foods that are both highly processed and hyperpalatable. And I've worked with well over 1,000 clients over the past decade plus, and I haven't encountered a client who has had strong cravings for a low calorie, highly satiating, healthy food source like carrots, cucumbers, or celery. But I've had a ton of clients and plenty of clients who have reported craving things like chocolate, cookies, and cakes. Now, research finds that cravings for highly processed foods commonly occur even when individuals are satiated and aren't actually experiencing true hunger. And the most commonly craved foods are all common highly processed foods like chocolate, sweets, and pizza. And the neural substrates underpinning cravings for highly processed foods and other addictive substances often overlap. So they have very similar components in terms of how they activate our brain reward system. As with tobacco, stimuli paired with highly processed foods become motivational cues, and cue induced cravings for highly processed foods are implicated in more frequent intake of highly processed foods, a loss of control over the intake of these foods, which can often lead to binge eating episodes or overeating occasions, difficulty losing weight, and a failure to reduce highly processed food intake, even in the face of serious health consequences, whether that be uh, derailments to your body composition progress, issues with metabolic health, even like, disease risk and things of that sort. And in contrast to highly processed foods, food cravings, when we look at cravings for minimally processed foods like fruits and vegetables, they're much less frequent. And they're unlike with processed foods, consuming minimally processed whole foods is associated with positive health outcomes such as higher diet quality, successful weight loss, and much better metabolic health. There's also evidence that finds that highly processed foods, but not minimally processed foods, meet the criteria of trigger triggering strong cravings or urges in a manner consistent with that of an addictive substance. So overall, this review found that highly processed foods meet all four criteria to be labeled as addictive substances using the standard set for tobacco products. And the addictive potential of highly processed foods may be a key contributing factor to the high public health costs associated with our food environment, which currently is dominated by cheap, accessible, and heavily marketed highly processed foods. So these are, this is the most recent review on this literature, and it does find that there's many foods, especially those within the highly processed hyperpalatable category, that could be labeled as being addictive like substances. Next, I want to cover some common foods that have been found to cause addictive like behaviors and symptoms in the literature. So in 2015, a two-part study was conducted to investigate the evidence for foods and food attributes implicated in addictive like eating. In part one of this study, processed foods, particularly those higher in fat and glycemic load, which would mean sugar and carbohydrate content, were most frequently associated with addictive like eating behaviors. Then in part two of this study, food processing was a large positive predictor for whether a food was associated with problematic addictive like eating behaviors. And when looking at these studies and which foods were found to cause the most frequent addictive like eating behaviors, they found that in study one, chocolate, ice cream, french fries, pizza, cookies, chips, cake, popcorn, which was buttered popcorn, cheeseburgers, and muffins were the top ranked addictive foods. Whereas in study two, pizza, chocolate, chips, cookie, ice cream, french fries, cheeseburger, full sugar sodas, and cakes were the most addictive foods. So what research finds is that it's that highly processed and hyperpalatable foods, which have a high concentration of refined fats and carbs and sugars, are the most likely to cause addictive like eating behaviors. So to finish this podcast out, I want to just provide you with a few tips on how to minimize your consumption of addictive foods. Now, first and foremost, we need to realize that not all foods are created equal. And this is true on multiple levels. Not all foods are created equal from a satiety and hunger management perspective, as some foods are more satiating and easier to moderate. And some are on the opposite end of the spectrum. They're much less satiating and more seductive and easy to overconsume. So some foods can be your go-to foods essentially. So this could be the whole foods that make up the vast majority of your diet. And then other foods can be triggers due to their addictive properties. And this is why it's important for you to find the foods that satiate and satisfy you, which you can moderate your consumption of. Let yourself pick foods that help you stay more in alignment with your goals, meaning that they help you to feel well nourished, satiated, and also keep you from being more likely to veer off track. Then from there, you should look to identify what your trigger foods are and minimize or avoid your consumption of them. And in order to accomplish this, I suggest reflecting on both your eating habits and behaviors, because many overeat due to a lack of awareness, which is where keeping a food diary to identify your triggers can be extremely helpful. So try to write down what cues prompt you to want to eat. That could be emotional cues, that could be food cues in your environment, like just exposure to a certain food. That could be being around people that are eating those foods. Whatever it may be, you're going to have to find your own particular cues and triggers. You want to write down times of the day you experience the most true hunger and the most hedonic hunger, meaning when throughout the day do you experience actual true hunger where you have, growling in your belly, you feel very empty, lightheaded, things of that sort, and try to place meal times around those times that you experience most true physiological hunger. And then you have to also realize the times that you're just wanting to eat out of boredom, wanting to eat out of stress, when you come home and you plop out on the couch after a long day of work and you automatically reach for that bag of chips or for that popcorn to watch your movie with. Is it that you truly need that food? Is it really in line with your goals? Is it that you're eating for true physiological hunger, or is this just a habit? Because a lot of people eat more out of habit than they do out of hunger. And then another thing to list or to include within that food diary are what foods you find yourself struggling to not overeat or struggling with overeating, if this is something that's becoming a habit for you. And from there, be sure to prepare your meals in advance. So, really, the biggest thing that I could suggest is preparation is one of the biggest keystone habits to being successful, especially from a nutritional and fitness perspective. So, stop trying to wing it and relying on willpower. Many will use the convenience of crap food as a cop out, but if you truly want to transform your physique and your health, you need to be intentional about your food decisions and your meal composition, which can easily be done if you just prepare your foods in bulk and in advance. And you don't have to rely on convenience or on preparing things last minute to be able to suit your goals and fit your needs. I would also suggest that you go back to last week's episode, which was episode 106 on the best way to kill food cravings, as I did a full, I believe it was 50 plus minutes. It was a full episode on strategies to reduce cravings and how to replace foods you're craving with healthier, more conducive alternatives. And this would fit very well in within the food addiction because these are strategies that you can use with any foods that you have trouble moderating. And I actually did a 4-part series on how to reduce overeating that could really complement this podcast well. So I believe that was podcast 101 through 104, and then 105 was on the science of food cravings. 106 was on the best way to kill food cravings. So if you guys haven't listened to, say, the last 6 episodes, I would definitely suggest you guys doing so. So that does it for another episode of the Chasing Clarity Health and Podcast, or Health and Fitness Podcast. If you need anything from me, whether that be one-on-one coaching or you're interested in, say, a private consultation via Zoom, please feel free to reach out to me through my email, which is bdecruzfitness@gmail.com. Or you guys can find me also on Instagram, where I provide daily content. Also, please remember to follow the show on iTunes and Spotify, leave a review, and share this episode on your stories so we can continue to reach more listeners. And so that I can really reach my goal, which is to have a positive effect on others, as I want to be able to bridge the gap between research and information and practical application so that all of you out there who are listening can look better, feel better, function better, and live a life that includes walking around with better body composition as well as a mindset of abundance. Hope you all have a great weekend, and I will talk to you all next week.